Welcome to Unsolicited UX, a podcast full of advice and opinions that you didn't ask for. I'm Jay Keatsman, and each month I'll be sitting down with a professional from the world of UX, product design, and tech to dig into their work, their wins, and their lessons learned, so you don't have to. Whether you're deep in the trenches or just a little UX curious, there's something here for everyone. Check out Unsolicited UX on Substack, Spotify, and YouTube, and enjoy the conversation. Dan Robbins, welcome to Unsolicited UX. Thank you for being here.
Pleasure. No, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Do you want to start by introducing yourself?
Sure. Sounds like a good starting point. So yeah, my name is Dan. You can find me on LinkedIn and Dan Robbins. I'm co-founder and global head of enterprise at Julo. So yeah, currently based here in the UK. I've been lucky enough to work and travel throughout a number of countries over the past few years since starting Julo, including Ireland, the US, Portugal, more recently Hungary as well. But yeah, here in the UK today.
Nice. And can you tell me again your current job title?
Yeah, so I'm global head of enterprise at Julo, but I'm also co-founder of Julo.
And yeah, I guess I shouldn't call it job, right? I guess when you're a co-founder, it's not a job. But what is that? How do you describe what that title means?
So, well, first and foremost, it means that I am typically responsible for the successful implementation of our solutions, be it our platform solution, our sort of training academy, our overall framework for our customers. So I predominantly these days work with our larger enterprise customers, right the way from initial conversations, so understanding the challenges the teams are facing when it comes to things like research, knowledge management, all the way through to implementation. So things like onboarding, training, ongoing optimization of our frameworks as well. So it really is wearing a lot of hats. I work with a lot of different teams, both internally and externally with our customers as well. And that's sort of typically just sort of works as my sort of title. But as you say, right, you know, as a founder, you're wearing so many hats. I'm very sort of heavily invested within the product and design side of our business as well, because that's where my background is. But typically, you know, my kind of core focus is working with larger enterprise customers at Julo now.
And you said your background is in product and design. So give me a little background. How'd you get here?
Sure. So, you know, it's a fairly conventional path, I guess, until you hit the sort of like founder kind of territory. But, you know, I studied design, early versions of user experience back in 2010 here in the UK. Out of university, I moved into more of a kind of UX architect role, which was quite all-encompassing back then. It was kind of encompassing of design, UI, UX, research, but also information architecture as well. So it was quite a sort of broad role. And I think this sort of UX term still very much being defined back then. But that's ultimately where I started. I kind of moved through sort of various design roles, all the way from kind of like UX research to sort of visual design and UI, into more of that kind of design lead art director role, sort of mid 2010s, worked across a bunch of different organizations, varying from kind of like large in-house international organizations and sort of working on optimization teams, but also working agency side. So working at build houses, graphic design agencies as well. Before starting Julo, I led design teams in London predominantly, but also New York, Gujarat in India, Geneva. So I've kind of had that experience of running international design teams as well, of which incorporated researchers as well as designers too. And then in 2020, right in the heart of the pandemic, I co-founded Julo alongside one of my best friends from childhood, actually. So he was also working in a sort of similar field. Oh. We sort of recognized an opportunity, and there's quite an interesting story about our sort of founding story, if you like, of the Julo platform.
Yeah, let's hear it.
I got to tee myself up a little bit there. Yeah, well, and the interesting thing was I kind of, I'd sort of had this idea that I wanted to start a business in the product UX, potentially UXR sort of space. Wasn't sure exactly what that was going to be. I knew that I'd experienced a bunch of challenges from working in that field and space personally for a long time. I discussed that with Nick, my co-founder, but as I said, childhood best friend, over numerous occasions, because he actually kind of came more from a sort of a product management background, but had experience in some of the same challenges as me. And it was actually the kind of intersection of those challenges that we experienced was in knowledge management, and how do we actually access insights that are being discovered across various different teams and functions in the organization so that we can continue to leverage them. We can have more certainty around the decisions we're making from his perspective in product, from my perspective in design and working with stakeholders. There was just a lot of kind of similarities with the challenges that we were both experiencing in our own unique roles and unique organizations. And so we figured, well, there's probably something in this. It's well worth us doing some discovery. But it was always our intention, knowing full well that when you start any research or discovery process, you go in with the best intentions to do a full discovery deep dive, and scope quickly diminishes. And so if we said, if we're going to start this company, we're going to do 6 months upfront discovery, we're going to build prototypes, we're going to test this with users, we're going to do user research, we're going to do surveys, we're going to do everything that is often the points in which you're kind of squeezed a little bit when kind of working in industry, particularly agency side, which was what we were most recently working in. And so we decided to go about that process. And then, of course, the pandemic happened and lockdown kind of came into play. My co-founder, Nick, was stuck in India from a trip that he was doing. And so we actually started Julo, and the initial conversations with Nick stuck in a yoga retreat. And so it's quite an interesting founding story. We then set about, having done that kind of discovery process, finding a technical co-founder, because whilst myself and Nick have been very involved in technical teams throughout our careers, we're not developers, we're not engineers who could build a complex system like the one we were designing. And so new challenges came from that as well, to find our third kind of co-founder, our technical co-founder, in a world which was completely locked down. So the interesting part behind that is that we met our co-founder, Mike, online, and worked with him for about 6 months before we were actually able to meet in person.
Oh, wow. I will say, if I was going to get stuck somewhere for the pandemic or for, hopefully, knock on wood, not a future pandemic.
That's the tough phase.
I wouldn't be so, I would think I would, I think I would choose a yoga retreat. Not a terrible place to be.
There's a lot worse places you could get stuck for sure.
So thank you for walking through sort of your journey. And you mentioned that when you were working sort of as an individual contributor, you had roles across the spectrum of UX, it sounds like, in terms of research to even visual design or UI design. What direction did that path go in? Were you visual designer to researcher, or researcher to visual designer?
Do you know what? It's a very interesting question, because when I first started my career, I was working at a company called RSA Group, a very large international insurance group. And at the time, we were working in Agile, and we were working in sort of Scrum teams with strategy, UXR, which was kind of not really the term being used at the time. It was more just general research, and UI design. And as a sort of graduate, I kind of joined as a little bit of a kind of tag along to each of those. So I was kind of a bit of a mix, really, just kind of supporting those teams. And it was a great opportunity for me to kind of experience that. Where I ended up sort of excelling and really sort of finding my feet within that particular organization was in UI design, actually. But I've always maintained an interest, either through doing it myself or through the people that I have in my teams, for UX research and strategy as well. So I've always been heavily involved in both, really. But primarily kind of focused more on UI design, actually, in my early stages of my career.
I think that's a good sign, though, that you had an interest in, I like the term knowledge management, because it applies to everyone. And I think researchers often want or are constantly trying to figure out how to socialize knowledge, right? Which is like a form of knowledge management. And so your stakeholders are the people who need to consume the information. So I love that. It makes sense to me.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's always been a fascination for me that we could work on a project which was very much encompassed by a product team, and we could discover some key fundamental insights that could benefit so many more teams, stakeholders, even leadership in large organizations. And often those insights are very much kept to a single project. And so it's always been a fascination for me around stakeholder management. It's something I focused a lot of my kind of the mentorship I received in my early stage of career was around stakeholder management, communication, sort of presenting insights, disseminating insights across organizations, because it's incredibly not only rewarding to sort of show people what you've discovered in this valuable insight. It also makes it more actionable, and so it makes your work more meaningful in my experience anyway. And so, yeah, that sort of like knowledge management piece of it has always been an interest of mine.
So share some of this knowledge with me. What's some of the best advice you got early in your career about stakeholder management?
So I think first of all, it's a good question. It's about knowing your audience, right? Stakeholders is such a broad term, and to apply the same way of approaching it with every stakeholder would be a serious mistake. And so I think the biggest early lesson I received was just around knowing your audience. And that applies to not just things like show and tells and the obvious things like presentations. It also just applies to the way you're communicating in a corridor conversation or in a Slack message. If I'm speaking to someone in senior leadership, the ultimate, they're looking for action, they're looking for insight, they're looking for what they can take and use to form a strategy. Whereas if I'm speaking to a designer or a product manager who's just trying to groom a backlog or trying to make some updates to a UI design, it's a very different type of conversation, because you want to get them into the weeds. You want them to understand and empathize with the problems that users are experiencing. And whilst you, of course, want to do that as well with senior stakeholders, senior leadership too, you have to be aware of their time, what they're ultimately looking for, and the benefits of the information that you're conveying to them as well. And so it's why we also see lots of teams that we work with actually producing kind of two types of reporting, right? You have the sort of like, this is my project team sort of research report, which is kind of goes into all the details. Anyone who wants to dive deeper into this can, and we can kind of go through those specifics and why we've made certain recommendations. Whereas the sort of high level senior stakeholder readout is 10 slides max. And it's very much just, here's what we learned. Here's why you can trust it, i.e. the evidence. And most importantly, here's the recommendations off the back of it. They don't need to go into those details as much. And actually, we often encourage teams to kind of focus on sort of linking out to those details or that raw data or evidence if people want to dive deeper into that, but not necessarily overwhelming them. So I think that would be probably the key lesson for me. It's the same with most careers, right? Know your audience and know who you're speaking to, and that's going to make a huge impact.
Something that I hope that, and maybe artificial intelligence is not the answer, but I'm going to assume for a second that it is. But something I hope that it can solve for is audience tailoring of information. Because I really feel like report writing is such I'm going to call it an administrative task. Like it's the mundane part of the knowledge collection. And then to have to do multiple types of reports within that, I just hope it's something that can be streamlined in the future.
Absolutely. I mean, I can see that happening already, right? Even just using something like ChatGPT now, you can now upload documentation into the free version. Obviously, anyone listening, be careful of what you're uploading into these large language models. But from a technological perspective, that's absolutely possible, right? You can take a document, you can put it into a large language model and say, this is everything I want to say. now spin this out into a version for a senior stakeholder, for a designer, for a UX, for a fellow UX researcher who's looking to build on this research. You could spin it out for different audiences and very effectively, actually. And it's actually one of the things that we've built into the Julo platform is this ability to find key information, summarize research documentation in a way that's going to be kind of like a too long didn't read, but doing that in a sort of safer environment, which isn't going to be used for training models, etc. And sort of that's the benefits, I guess, of using sort of specific software for those tasks. But the technology itself is absolutely there.
That's awesome. Right. What a GDPR nightmare, though, to have to navigate giving your, especially like something like interview results, like people's private privacy of recordings and whatnot, giving that to a third party, even if the results are spectacular. I imagine that that's a bit of a headache.
It absolutely is. And it's something that teams are becoming more and more accustomed to navigating. When AI first, or large language models specifically first became a major deal, probably about a year and a half ago now or something like that, when they became a bit more mainstream, we were working at the forefront of that sort of AI revolution, if you like. And so many of the organizations that we were already working with were so anti-AI because of these reasons, and for good reason. Legal InfoSec teams were quite hesitant to jump on this. But actually, over the course of the last year and a half, we have seen a sort of a change in perceptions around AI and how to safely leverage that technology, because ultimately teams, but specifically organizations that aren't leveraging AI at this point are going to start to fall behind the companies and the organizations that are really embracing it. And so teams are starting to become more pragmatic to it. And you do have, in our case at least as well, when we work with enterprise teams, and again, this is part of my kind of role as enterprise, kind of head of enterprise, would be to have specific terms of service, data processing agreements in place so that everyone can be comfortable with how that information and data is being used.
Yeah. So this is my own lack of knowledge, but I suppose that's why you're here. How has that changed? Like, what has that change looked like in terms of how are they making the ease of, I guess, how do I ask this question? Companies were not comfortable with it. And I understand there is a bit of like a social perception piece of it where it was considered too risky 2 years ago. And today it's becoming normalized socially. That's probably a huge piece of it. But there's also the legal and the behind the scenes and the GDPR and making sure things are actually viable. So like what's changed on the back end that's making it more accessible and more mainstream?
It's a great question. So first of all, from a sort of large language model provider, there's now multiple options. It's not just OpenAI that have a large language model, and there are very specific tools that can be used which offer different sort of processing agreements, etc. But I think most importantly, the sort of shift, at least in our perspective, changed when OpenAI, for example, went from having a large language model which is trained by all of the data that's being put into it to actually saying, hey, monetizing this and saying, hey, look, there's large enterprise here that could get a ton of value out of the technology that we've developed. So we will have enterprise grade subscriptions where our promise to you is that that data never gets used to train models. And so as an example, when organizations use our platform and the AI features inside them, they are benefiting from the fact that we have an enterprise grade subscription and agreement with OpenAI to say that none of the data that we use your large language model for will ever be used to train models, and all of that data will be contained within your repository. And so it's those kind of shifts where the AI technology and platforms and organizations have started to recognize, whilst there's a benefit to training models en masse, there's also a real benefit commercially to start kind of reining that in and now enabling organizations to have a safer way of using that technology, and for them to benefit from that as well from a sort of more financial perspective.
So is there a term for that? I'm getting like bespoke generative AI, or like something corporate. What do they call that?
I would sort of encompass that from the conversations that I have as enterprise large language model, because it's built for enterprise with these specific kind of processes and data processing agreements in place.
I'm realizing that I'm not sure that I asked you yet about what your company actually is. So before I dive into asking you specifics, maybe give a little brief introduction of what your company is and what it does.
Sure. So, Julo is a knowledge management solution. So we essentially work with organizations in a number of different ways. It's specifically designed for teams who are conducting research, whether that's UX research, which is where we predominantly focused to begin with, but more recently, market research, data science, any team conducting research, collecting data, synthesizing insights around customer, market, competitor, whatever that may be. So our solution combines technology, but also with our industry-renowned knowledge management framework to help organizations maximize the value and the impacts of the insights that they're discovering as part of these processes and the research that they're doing. So we are bespoke. We do specialize in a more hands-on approach. We have a bunch of teams that are just kind of going off and doing their thing and using our technology, but typically we do work directly with teams, whether that's a UX research team, a design team, a market insights team, and often actually support the process of bringing these teams together to start sharing insight and breaking down knowledge silos in organizations. But we do that in order to help just maximize the value and impact of the research that's being done. To my point earlier, so much research and insight gets discovered which remains within the heads of individuals or locked within reports which get buried on a shared drive or just stay within the project team and the immediate stakeholders. And actually, we exist to help disseminate that knowledge and start finding the connections, the patterns, the gaps, the opportunities that might exist if you start to bring that information and teams together.
So, okay. And so this is within the realm of like what you would call a research repository. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. I mean, we like to sort of think of the technology as one aspect of knowledge management. And actually, we do have an academy training, for example. We work with a lot of government teams who just are only able to use the tools that are in their existing arsenal. And just the process of kind of procuring new software and tooling is difficult. And so repositories, yes, but not necessarily just purely around our own technology. We believe knowledge management requires not just technology to support it, it's the processes and people that surround it as well, which make it effective.
I love that. So how do you incorporate that into what you're selling? Like, how is that a play? What role does that play?
It's an interesting one actually as well. And, it is why I've taken on this role predominantly within the organization as co-founder. It's extremely important for us to empathize with customers in the same way that a UX researcher or a market insights professional would. We need to understand the specific and unique challenges that organizations are facing. So we often work with leadership teams, but we also work directly with UX research teams and say, well, how are you approaching insight management? How are you sharing insights? How many requests are you receiving from around the organization, around the insights you already have? How are you conducting meta-analysis so you can look at all the research that's been doing and all of the insights that have been discovered and understand where there's potential opportunities or maybe gaps in your knowledge to start strategizing around? And so we ask these kind of questions to just get a real sense for where teams are at. And to be honest with you, it really varies depending on the organization you're speaking to. And that's not to say a sort of like a high maturity organization is actually doing this any better than a team that's very small and starting out. And actually really, I think it really sort of it varies considerably. And, we work with a lot of organizations that you would think are much further along in their understanding than they perhaps are in this. And so a big part of our role is to say, well, we've got this whole suite of training, kind of academy resources and workshops and working sessions that we can go through with your stakeholders, your leadership, your researchers. We have this platform technology. We also have a sort of fundamental sort of like sharing out and distribution system that we use for knowledge. And it's really a case of me finding what the sort of unique combination of that is that was going to achieve the biggest impact for us to kind of come in and work for an organization. And it really is, and it sounds cliche, but it's really about figuring out how we can work with customers rather than for them. We're not just providing them a technology and saying, hey, best of luck, go for it. We believe in this sort of mantra of think big, but start small and figure out exactly the steps we need to take to achieve the biggest impact.
Okay. See, I'm glad that you made that clarification because that makes a lot of sense. You're essentially selling more than a technology. It's a process, and you do more with companies than just sell a platform. Okay. The reason why I brought up research repository is because I think that it is fairly common, at least within UX research, that there is a research repository or a goal to have a repository for research, but it is often a very passive thing that can be as stagnant as a OneDrive folder or, the shelf collecting dust kind of thing. And so what I wanted to kind of get to is I'm curious about who you consider your target users. And then I have questions about their experience, and I would love to open up the hood on that a little as much as you're comfortable with.
And absolutely. So, I think the thing to remember about knowledge management is that there are contributors and consumers. There are obviously people who are both, UX researchers, for example, but for the most part, we have people who are going to be contributing new insights, new knowledge, and there's going to be people who need to use those insights and new knowledge to action it and to make better decisions and de-risk the various different projects that they're working on. That means ultimately the purpose of doing research and discovering insights. And so we have found that segmenting users in this way is a helpful place to start. We like to bring kind of cross-functional teams together, including both contributors and consumers initially as part of the kind of beginning of this project, and sort of say, well, what is it that you're looking to get out of a repository? What's the ultimate vision? What's the ultimate goals you have towards it? And what we find actually is that once you sort of delivered a sort of baseline solution, the repository's built, and we're kind of starting to get more people coming in and using it, in order to stop that becoming stagnant, we need to have an ongoing strategy around engagement, measuring impact and ROI of the repository itself, as well as the research that's being conducted. And if you can do that in a way which is being managed, particularly if it's supported by a third party like us, but also we give teams of training to do this, then it's more likely to be continued to use and more likely to become a standard process or habit for researchers and stakeholders alike as well. Because like you say, what we don't want to do is come in, work with you to build a repository, and then that quickly becomes as stagnant as a shared drive sort of solution, right? The purpose here is that we're trying to encourage people to use this information more effectively and use that repository to start building on knowledge rather than just allowing it to stagnate. So we found that stakeholders, for example, interact with repositories in very different ways to researchers. Some of the interesting data we've collected around this is that, researchers are typically using repositories for literature reviews. And so they'll be doing a lot more kind of keyword search, a lot more filtering, which they're a lot more comfortable with in terms of the use of taxonomies and tagging systems. They're doing that deep exploration. They're doing pattern analysis. They're looking for the little nuances across research reports, across insights that have been discovered. Whereas stakeholders need answers now. right? And so they typically are going to be using our AI queries more frequently. We have a feature called Ask AI, where essentially anyone in the organization, whether you're a stakeholder, a designer, or a UX researcher, can go in and ask a specific question in natural language using the large language model technology that we talked about earlier, and actually say, have we got any research on this? So given the insights that we've discovered across all past studies, what would be the most effective strategy to target churn or acquisition? And some of these kind of complex questions that are likely going to be coming up in real time in stakeholder and leadership meetings. That's where we see stakeholders and leadership really leveraging those types of features, and less so actually kind of search and filter, which are more sort of specific to deep diving, which would be kind of more representative of a sort of like a UX researchers or a market researchers kind of use case for the repository. So they are quite different ways of interacting itself with the repository. I think the big thing to remember is that...
So can I ask a question quick?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So I'm just very curious about this. You said, so the stakeholder, the leadership level, you're finding that they're using a more natural language approach. Are they essentially kind of asking questions to the repository to get sort of a synthesized output, like almost a recommendation?
Yeah. So the sort of distinction, I guess, between Julo repositories and perhaps some of the kind of industry sort of more well-known repositories is that Julo is not used to analyze data. It is a space where synthesized research lives. So you'd only put synthesized insights, reports, documentation, white papers, playbooks, whatever it may be, into the repository, which means that data has been desensitized, but also synthesized by a trained professional, by someone who understands research, understands how to take raw data and turn that into insights and actions and recommendations. And so what our Ask AI feature does is essentially take all of that information across the hundreds, if not thousands of documents in your repository, and it allows you to pull in the sources and the information from those documents, from those insights, and provide you with recommendations. Now, importantly, whenever we provide a recommendation, it will always need to be tied to a specific cited source. And so any piece of information that the large language model gives you back must go right back into the slide or specific word within a document where you could, as a stakeholder or a researcher, dive into and do a further analysis on and just make sure you're comfortable with what it's telling you. But it essentially just gets you from 0 to 1 extremely quickly, which is why I think we've observed this kind of pattern and behavior and the usage of stakeholders versus sort of researchers and people on the ground.
A potentially unintended use case for this that I like, or what I'm hearing, is that it makes it more actionable in terms of you can get the right people in the room quicker. Yeah. Like the person who wrote the slide is most likely attached to the document. And now you might find 3 documents. That means you have 3 people at your company that you can get into a meeting the same day and have a productive conversation. That's pretty cool.
Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the kind of knowledge retrieval is one of the biggest use cases for a repository. And to your point, it's a great point. Finding the individuals who are involved in that research and being able to say, right, cool, well, the repository has literally pulled together the 3 most relevant sources that we need to look at. And I can see the 3 people that worked on them. Let's get those people into this meeting so that we can have a discussion around it. Even if it's just making that process more efficient, it helps a lot. Research is about action. It's about sort of informing strategy. And it's often based on the patterns that emerge across projects and studies and products as well, where you can deliver the biggest impact. And so the AI just helps to sort of accelerate that process so that you can do that in real time. You can imagine sitting in a meeting as a researcher, and I had this so many times, and this is one of the interesting kind of sort of initial founding stories of Julo, is that the amount of sort of meetings that I would be sitting with a senior stakeholder, and I would say, yeah, we've done research on this. We have some insights around this. You're going to have to give me today, maybe tomorrow, and I can get something back to you. And we're in a meeting where a stakeholder's like, yeah, cool. I need to make a decision right now. And so, that was one of the kind of core problems that I had experienced, but also my co-founder Nick had experienced from a product management perspective. And so we enable those real-time knowledge retrieval processes so that people can either make decisions or quickly get people into the room that they need to speak to and have a deeper discussion with.
So is there anything, so you mentioned the Ask AI feature, which I would like to try. Actually, I think I'm pretty intrigued by that. But is there anything else that has surprised you about the user behavior of either user type?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think that when we initially built the system, we had anticipated that teams were moving away from research reports and actually moving towards a more dynamic way of presenting and sharing insights, which is a little bit more interactive. And I still believe that will kind of happen. It's just a slower shift than we were anticipating 3 or 4 years ago. We do have some teams using Julo for that purpose, but for the most part, teams are still uploading full kind of synthesized reports into our repository. And one of the key features that we have from that is that we use AI to then extract key insights from that document. So you don't have to go through and manually say, oh yeah, here's some insights we also want to upload into the system as well as these kind of documents. Actually, what happens is the AI will say, hey, it looks like there's 5 or 6 key insights in this document here. Would you like us to extract those from the document, tag them up as well for you? And what that allows you to do, which we hadn't realized, was start to build what we now call collections or themed knowledge areas of the insights that are relevant and around sort of common topics that have been discovered across multiple different products or projects or studies. And so we actually ended up building quite early on into our process this kind of collections feature, which enabled teams to start building collections around, this is all the insight that we know about onboarding. This is all the insights that we know about acquisition or payments. And one of the unexpected sort of use cases for that is that we found that or heard from other teams using this, it's an incredibly powerful onboarding tool. So if you can imagine a stakeholder joining or a new leader joining or a new researcher joining, and they're going to be working on a very specific area of a product or a very specific journey within your product lifecycle, being able to say, here's all the insights we know and have discovered about this particular area that you're going to be working on. Spend a day in this collection and you're going to know what we know about this and you're going to be able to hit the ground running. So actually, definitely an unexpected sort of byproduct of the repository and collections is the ability to more effectively onboard not just researchers, but anyone, wider teams, stakeholders, leadership as well.
So I did some snooping around on your blog,
Right?
and one of the articles that you wrote was called "UX Research Reports is not the deliverable," or the UX Research Report is not the deliverable.
Yeah.
And you discuss outcome over output, which I love. This is a topic that I could talk about for a while, but I would like to hear from you. And if you have any tips for maximizing impact and long-term value with the report specifically.
Okay. It's a great question. It's been a little while since I wrote that one, so I'd have to sort of refresh myself. But I think that, this still absolutely stands. The report is not the deliverable. I think that maybe not so much kind of UX researchers, designers doing UX research, anyone doing research. I think most people know that the report is not the deliverable. It's not the output. But most sort of stakeholders need to be educated around that, right?
Yeah, because and the area that I'm particularly interested in is that we know it's not we know the output is not the goal, right? The outcome is, but getting that engagement and getting that action making the report actionable is not easy, because you can reformat, you can change your approach, you can tailor to your specific stakeholder. But at the end of the day, it's not a solo preneur. Like, it's something that has to be done, within a group.
Yeah, totally. And I think it's about sort of maximizing actionability, right? And so the same goes for when you're sharing an insight, similarly to a report as well. It needs to cover a good bit of bases. You need to have that sort of high level overview. You need to make sure that the sort of context is given: who, what, where, when, is this going to be relevant to me? But most importantly, aside from providing evidence for this, you need to provide recommendations and actionability. So at the end of a report, if you can provide some tactical recommendations, or even if it's just how might we statements, right? Something that is a recommendation to show that you're not just a research producer or a data gatherer, you are a strategic advisor. That's the way that we like to sort of get researchers specifically to kind of think about. And so that report is just the vehicle to providing that advice. And so the advice itself, the report itself, is just a way of providing recommendations and insights and actions. And so, first of all, make it around that. Keep focus on that. Unfortunately, stakeholders, particularly senior stakeholders, are not that interested in all the specifics. As interesting it was to do the study, they're interested in actions and possibilities and recommendations, right? So doing that. But also, I would say beyond the report, and I believe this is maybe something I touched upon in that particular article, is how do you continue to achieve actionability beyond that, so that artifact, that report, doesn't just become, like you mentioned earlier, this stagnated asset. We like to look at reports and insights as enterprise assets that can be reused and generate repeatable value. And so in order to do that, we believe you need to have a centralized repository of insights, somewhere where the insights from that report can be indexed, organized, and connected to other insights. So you can start triangulating that data and say, well, actually, we did a study about retention 3 months ago, and these insights are, further, evidencing that or actually challenging that, whatever it may be. It's this triangulation of data that allows for those reports to continue delivering value and those insights to continue being actionable. If you just let that die, it's only got a certain shelf life, the research report. But actually, a lot of strategic foundational research has evergreen possibilities and has the ability to continue adding value a long time after the report itself. And so there is a bit of work for a researcher to do, not just in repository building, but also stakeholder management, continued follow-ups as well, to make sure that those insights get actions. Is something that I kind of talk about quite a lot on LinkedIn, actually, is around researchers and teams conducting research need to become better marketers. The more you're putting your insights out there, the more people see them in the organization. Familiarity and exposure builds trust. And it also means that your work's going to be actioned more. It's not the final deliverable at the end of a study as you've handed over the research report, right, move on to the next study and forget about that. It's your responsibility as a researcher to continue finding ways to apply the insights that you discovered in past projects and other researchers have discovered as well to get more value from them.
Well, first of all, I no longer identify as a researcher. I would like my new title to be strategic advisor. That might be my favorite thing I've heard in a long time. I now consider myself a strategic advisor. Change that on my LinkedIn. But what you're mentioning about you didn't explicitly mention making repositories or reports more dynamic, but is this where the microsite concept comes in? Because you've also written about that a bit.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, the microsite. And again, it's something that we continue to develop our understanding around. It's something I touched upon earlier insofar as sort of looking at the research report as quite a static way of presenting findings. And as we talked about, there's different audiences that are going to need varying depths of information. So our concept initially at Julo was to build kind of mini websites or microsites around a research report rather than it being in a kind of PowerPoint static presentation. And the benefit of that is that what you can do in Julo, for example, is kind of say, here's the insights that I've discovered at the highest level. If you'd like to dive into the facts behind these insights, the evidence behind these insights, some of the user interviews or the sort of survey data behind these insights, click on them and dive deeper into the insights themselves. And the benefit of that is that you can also control who can do that. So sharing personally identifiable information across organizations, even internally, is, a big challenge that research teams need to be aware of. And so even sharing that information and data with stakeholders is risky, to some degree. It's why having a self-servable repository in the same tool that you're collecting raw data and doing analysis in, there's a little bit of a kind of conflict there, because you don't really want to open up that tool to everyone in your organization, because first of all, it's overwhelming and most senior stakeholders and leadership don't need to see that information. But secondly, you are at risk of breaching GDPR, PII regulations. And so the concept of a microsite allows you to kind of build this single sort of way of presenting insight, but allow multiple levels of engagement, multiple levels of security in terms of the depth of the data that people can see, but it also provides other benefits. You have things like analytics. So you can more effectively track who's engaging with what insights, who's looking at what. But also, you have that sort of ability to, just more effectively sort of engage audiences beyond a more static presentation, which of course, in our instance, you'd be building into the repository. So you then don't need to upload a document or a report into a repository, because by building your report in the repository, that data is already there. It's something we can continue to kind of explore around. We certainly haven't found the perfect solution for that. And actually, we've got lots of teams experimenting, and big shout out to everyone that kind of continues to provide their feedback and support around that as well. But it is ultimately where we see the real potential for repositories, is that if the challenge is building a report and then just doing that process to get it into a repository, well, why not just build the report into the repository itself and make it more dynamic and interactive in the process?
Give it sort of like a front end.
Yeah.
A more engageable, something you can engage with.
Yeah. If you're getting Webflow or Framer or something similar, or a prototyping tool, it wouldn't be dissimilar from that.
Yeah. What are some common pitfalls that you find when people are building a knowledge repository?
I think it's a good question. I think the one that kind of springs to mind most prominently for me is thinking that they need to, first of all, centralize every piece of research data and every piece of research they've ever done. Actually, we find, as I mentioned earlier, kind of having that kind of principle of think big, start small, initially centralizing the most strategically valuable research you've done, the most recent work you've done, building a repository as an opportunity to even archive down previous historical research, which is no longer relevant. So I think that would be the main one. So many teams go, we need to build a repository, right? We need 3 months to just centralize absolutely everything we've got. And actually, we found that we could do something in a few days, which is going to be, these are the 20 most strategically valuable insights that we hold as a team about this particular topic, and kind of really focusing on something specific. What stakeholders can we share this information with, which is going to have the biggest impact? Right, cool. Well, this stakeholder is working on this particular area of the product. This leader's really concerned about retention or acquisition at the moment. Let's send it to them as well. And start small, get some feedback around that, and then start to figure out, right, cool, well, what would be the next most valuable pieces of information that we could centralize? Who would be the next most effective people that we can share this with? And so kind of approaching it in a sort of the same way that you would approach building any kind of product, thinking big, starting small, iterating, improving. So we often see lots of teams kind of going in thinking they need to build this, getting stakeholder buy-ins with this huge repository from the off, which I don't even know is going to necessarily work. And then also doing a big bang launch and saying, hey, everyone in the organization, we've just built a repository, go and use it. And then they're kind of surprised when there's kind of crickets in there, or sort of adoption sort of doesn't necessarily take off. And that's why we guide teams through a process of thinking big, starting small, iterating, building what we call research champions, finding individuals, groups to initially start with, get some feedback, and letting growth happen organically within organizations. So that would probably be the biggest pitfalls, I'd say, is just thinking you need this big bang launch with every piece of research you've ever done, and that's simply not true.
Yeah, I like that you compare it to building any product, right? Because essentially the repository, if that's the word we want to use, is a product for your company. And then also, like going with that metaphor, you don't want to bake limitations into the product before you know how to best utilize it, right?
Absolutely. Well, I think, the age-old sort of expression around UX research and doing research in the first place is that things are a lot more expensive to fix later, right? So test and learn.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so I have seen that recently on LinkedIn, you shared an article by Brad Organ, I believe is his name, called Why It's Time for Research to Move Beyond UX. And seems like one of the main themes in there is around centralized research organizations. And so I just would love to hear your perspective on that. Is that relevant to to your approach to the philosophy?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, this is an interesting article by Brad Organ. I actually also did an interview with Janelle Ward a couple of years back now, actually, who's also a research leader in the space around this concept of kind of centralized insight functions. And I think that Brad, I believe in that article, makes a really interesting kind of point that having tried it, to kind of go in and reorg, a large organization around sort of centralized insights functions is an extremely difficult task. It's often an uphill battle for a research leader to kind of walk into an organization saying, hey guys, we're just going to reorg everything. People that, market insight researchers who are reporting into a CMO are now going to report into kind of centralized insights function along with UX research and data science. It becomes very messy, very complex, and is ultimately most likely going to receive a ton of pushback. And what I like about Brad's kind of pragmatic approach, having experienced that kind of pushback himself, was actually saying, well, what's the next best thing that we could kind of start this process? And again, to our point on the previous question, test and learn. I think it's about kind of building cross-functional insight working groups. So it's very much kind of falls under our framework is, I mentioned it earlier, research champions. A big part of what we do and what we're brought in to facilitate for organizations is saying, right, who are the key individuals that we need to get into a room to start breaking down these knowledge silos? Who has access to customer? Who's getting a ton of insight about X? Where's the data science representatives? Let's get these people in a room and start, I think, initially just agreeing on what we define as an insight, right? You'd be surprised how differing in opinion a customer success representative would deem an insight compared to a strategic UX researcher, right? There's going to be varying levels of...
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Strategic advisor. Sorry.
Strategic advisor. Yeah, my apologies. So yeah, exactly. So, you have strategic advisors kind of talking about insights in very different ways to a customer support representative who might kind of be receiving a ton of raw data in the form of kind of tickets and requests and customer feedback. But what constitutes an insight? And so that can change and vary between organization and team. And so first of all, we kind of like to create these kind of cross-functional insight working groups for want of a better name, to kind of bring these individuals together and say, well, within this organization, how do we define an insight? What is the difference between a tactical insight and a more strategic insight? How can we prioritize sharing those more strategic insights across functions and across teams? And actually just starting to have that conversation is extremely valuable, because at that point you can say, great, well, if we were building a repository, say, together, hypothetically speaking, how would we structure this data? What's going to be an effective way to organize this information so that all of us can access it, regardless of what team we sit in? So that's where we start moving into things like talking about like tagging systems and taxonomies and global taxonomies as well, which I'm not going to kind of go into too much detail today. We don't have time. But ultimately, that it all very much forms part of our approach. And so creating these kind of cross-functional working groups is kind of the next best step. And what we have seen is that in some instances, particularly in some of the sort of like more lean and agile organizations we work with, it does spark those conversations of, well, actually, would it just make sense if we structured the org a little bit more effectively around these insight functions? But that happens organically. It's about knowing the way and showing the way, rather than kind of coming in, which I think is what Brad experienced in his article, and saying, hey, we just need to change the org structure here. Everything needs to kind of have this insight function, and it just doesn't work. And so it very much lines up to our approach of working directly with teams to just start those conversations.
I think I'm going to make the claim that is a human nature thing. That it's like, because essentially what you're describing is that someone needs to think it's their idea to change the org structure. So it's like you lead them to your idea so that they realize and then present to you the idea that we should reorg.
Yeah, exactly. Great idea. Great idea. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I love that idea. Okay, Dan. Well, I'm very intrigued by this idea of these working groups, right? Because it's almost like a way to de-silo without trying to change the whole company around.
Yeah.
So I like that.
Exactly.
But for the sake of time, I just have two final questions that I want to ask you. Sure. The first being, what is a UX or work-related opinion that you might hesitate to share in a meeting?
Interesting. Okay. Something that I might hesitate is, it's a controversial opinion, but I do believe that since we've been working more heavily with dedicated research teams, there is somewhat of an oversimplification of research in recent years, particularly in the UXR field. I think that we have moved from very in-depth foundational mixed method studies to quite a sort of single method user interview approach. Now, that's not the fault of the researchers. That's responding to the needs of the organization. And I think that sort of there's no one at fault for that. But I do, as I said, believe that UX research as a function is there to be the strategic advisors of the organization. And it's very difficult to do that if you're only getting surface level insights from very few different methods. And so, is one of the things that inspired me to work in the UXR field and with UX researchers. And I've worked with some amazing different practitioners over the years, is because of just seeing how many different methods that were being used to synthesize this knowledge. And I think that is something that is maybe a little bit controversial to talk about, particularly with the whole argument around democratization in the UX research field. But that would probably be one of the sort of like, I guess, controversial opinions that I kind of have at the moment that I'm talking about a little bit on LinkedIn. Two mixed sort of kind of responses, actually. And actually on that topic of democratization as well, it is something that I am seeing a shift towards. I think that democratization at first was seen as this big scary thing by the UXR field when product designers, product managers come in. But actually, democratization allows designers, product managers to learn new skills and support UXR more effectively. And it allows UXR to work less on tactical studies and more on that foundational strategic research that they ultimately most likely got in the industry to do. And so I think there is becoming this kind of shift in kind of perception of democratization and its benefits. But what we don't want is for researchers to just feel like they have to become these kind of research trainers to train everyone how to do research. And so there's interesting topic, which I'm sure we could talk about for hours, but it's probably one of the more controversial discussions that I've been having with various people behind closed doors and a little bit on LinkedIn recently.
Yeah, I'm going to mostly bite my tongue because this is a topic I could talk about for a long time. But what I'll say is that my hypothesis on this, or part of my speculation, is that there is always this push. UXR is a funny department because companies think they need it, but then there's all this pushback like, oh, you're slow. Oh, research takes too much time. Oh, we don't need. Oh, I knew that. Like, it's like there's this defensive-ness or I don't know. We could speculate on what it is. But my hypothesis is that the tool belt has shrunk in a lot of ways in recent years in response to this feeling that UXR needs to be more business minded. We need to compromise to the business goals and needs more, and like this push to be more relevant within the company is like, okay, well then I'm going to turn and burn. I'm going to get out. I'm going to strategically advise faster, as opposed to doing thorough, more academic, rigorous research that you are trained on, but then told in industry, oh, we don't have time for that.
Yeah.
It's
totally.
It's kind of a funny conundrum.
It is a difficult predicament, and it's something that UXR is, I think, experiencing somewhat of an identity crisis at the moment, a little bit. I'm sure you would have seen the UXR reckoning kind of articles and everything that kind of went pretty big in the industry last year. And I think that there's an education piece for stakeholders and for organizations for the best use of research and the freedom and time you need to give those individuals and practitioners to deliver the value that you're expecting. But there is also, an education piece on the research side of things to become more business minded, right? A lot of other functions which are slightly more mature and have been around for a number of years longer have had to go through this process as well. It's just a little bit more difficult, unfortunately, for UXR. And it is something that we do focus a lot of our framework on, actually, is how to more efficiently and effectively demonstrate research ROI and the impacts you're having. And so it's not easy by any means. And again, it's probably one of those kind of broader discussion points that we can have perhaps in another conversation. But it is possible. And we are seeing some positive changes within organizations. And it's actually also often helped by building something like a cross-functional repository where stakeholders can really see, wow, when we have this data together in one place and I can, in a meeting in real time, ask a question and have the insights in my hands, that's where people can really start to go, wow, this is why we invested in all this research, rather than have we done any research on this topic in the past and says, let me get back to you in a couple of days. It's like, well, a couple of days is going to be too late. Unfortunately, we live in a fast-paced world. So it's an interesting topic we could discuss all day, I'm sure.
Maybe Julo can be a tool that leads business leadership for it to be their idea, that we have long-term visions and planning that create space for proper research.
Absolutely. Yeah. And how you can kind of tie research to those top level visions, goals, OKRs, metrics, right? And so you can start to more effectively track the impact of it as well. And it's all stuff that we are in development with.
There you go. Maybe that's the trick right there. Okay. Final question. It's a question from a mentee. And what they wanted to know was just, what has been the most impactful learning moment in your career thus far, and how has it shaped you professionally?
Great question.
Just a small question.
Yeah, I was going to say, how do I even start on something like this? But no, it's a great question. I think that, for me, being open to feedback has been the biggest transition for me. Starting out from a design background, from what I studied, but then moving into research, whatever it may be, you're going to get what we call the IKEA effect, I guess, sort of like confirmation bias towards your own work. And so actually sort of transitioning myself from being quite reactive, I guess, to feedback in my early stages of my career, kind of taking feedback that was negative quite personally. I think that the biggest sort of transition for me was having a mentor which actually said, no, feedback is the most powerful thing you can get to deliver the most value from your work. It may not be nice to hear if you've just stayed late for the last few days to get this presentation ready and you've received feedback that wasn't what you were hoping for. But ultimately, we're here to provide a service and do a job and make things happen. And at the end of the day, we can only do that with feedback. And so learning to be able to take that gracefully, but also look at it as an opportunity to improve, I think was a real turning point in my career off the back of kind of, I think it was a particular presentation that I'd slogged away at for weeks and received some pretty negative feedback, to then have my mentor, who was also in the room at the time afterwards, just sort of explain just how important it is to get better at taking feedback and see it as a positive. I think that was a really important sort of pivotal moment for me. And it also inadvertently helped me to get better at dealing with imposter syndrome, which is something that I'm sure that everyone has experienced in some form or another. So having that ability to also almost welcome sort of feedback or preempt negative feedback and say, look, I know this isn't perfect. You can give me positive feedback, but what I'm really looking for is what you don't like, what I could improve, what would make this better so that we can together have a better outcome. And to your point there as well, Jay, you have people that are involved in the process then, and where they have to contribute their own ideas, are also more likely to be receptive to what you're putting in front of them as well. So it can only benefit you and them to have more of that mentality.
Yeah. So I come from a performing arts background, and something that I took from that into my career was the seeking of feedback and critical feedback. And I think people that come from that go to art school or something and are used to a critique approach, it's such a benefit to have that early in your life, because you can bring that into your career and seek critique. If it becomes a model or a framework that you use for your own personal growth, huge benefit.
Seek critique. I'm going to steal that one.
Okay, Dan, lovely conversation. Thank you for taking the time to be here. Can you just mention again where people can find you online?
Sure. So find me on LinkedIn under Dan Robbins. You can check out what we do at Julo, both our platform, but also our academy, and how we help teams, including also the framework that we've developed at Julo.io. So DUALO.io. And I'm also on Twitter, or as they call it, X, under Dan Robbins as well. And I'm sure you can find me there too.
What do they call it now? Like you don't tweet someone. Do you X them?
You know what? I don't know. I'm pretty old school on that. I say tweet, but I'm not sure. Xer or something. I don't know what it's called.
Xer. Well, you can X him.
You can X me or DM me on LinkedIn.
There you go. DM. That's probably DM. Yeah. Okay, Dan. Have a good day.
Pleasure. Take care.